Someone you trusted decided you were expendable. Not a stranger, not an enemy you saw coming from a distance with their intentions written plainly on their face. Someone you let in. Someone who sat at your table, who knew your fears because you told them in moments of genuine openness, who held information about you that you handed over freely because you believed, because every signal they gave you supported the belief, that they were safe, that this was one of the relationships that holds rather than one of the relationships that breaks. And then they broke it. Maybe it was sudden. A single act so clear and so deliberate that there was no room for alternative interpretation, no way to construct the charitable reading that part of you immediately reached for anyway. Maybe it was slow, a pattern that accumulated over time until the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore, until you found yourself standing in the specific clarity that arrives when denial finally exhausts itself and the truth walks in without knocking. Maybe you found out from someone else. Maybe you watched it happen in real time and felt the strange, dissociating experience of witnessing something you had always known was possible and somehow never fully believed would occur. However it arrived, it arrived. And now you are standing in the aftermath of it, in the particular landscape that betrayal creates, which is unlike any other kind of pain because it is not just about what was lost, it is about what was never what you thought it was. It is about the retroactive revision of a past you thought you understood. Every memory now carries a question mark. Every conversation replays with new and unwelcome annotations. The person you trusted was always, underneath the trust, someone capable of this, and you did not see it. Or you saw it and chose not to look directly at it. And either way, you are here now, in the wreckage of something you built on ground that was never as solid as it appeared. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this landscape with a precision that most philosophers avoided, because most philosophers preferred to write about ideas rather than about the raw, specific texture of human experience at its most difficult. He wrote about betrayal, not always by name, but in its substance, because he lived it. He was dismissed, undermined, abandoned, and misunderstood by people he had genuinely trusted, people whose betrayals contributed to some of the most productive philosophical fury in the history of human thought. He did not emerge from those experiences preaching forgiveness in the conventional sense, or advocating for the graceful absorption of injury as a spiritual practice. He emerged from them with something colder, more honest, and ultimately more useful. He understood that betrayal is not just an event, it is a revelation. It reveals the structure of the other person's character. It reveals the limits of their loyalty. It reveals the hierarchy of their values. And, more painfully, it reveals something about you, about where you ignored your own instincts, about where you confused intensity for integrity, about where you projected depth onto someone who had only ever mirrored you well enough to remain close. This is the part most people try to escape. They want to reduce betrayal to a villain and a victim. They want a clean moral diagram where one side is wrong and the other side is wounded innocence. But reality is rarely that simple. Not because you deserved what happened, you didn't. Betrayal is a choice made by the person who commits it, always. But the conditions that allowed it, the access, the proximity, the unchecked assumptions, those are shared terrain. Nietzsche would not tell you to collapse into self-blame. He would tell you to extract information. Pain, in his framework, is data. It is not sacred. It is not redemptive by default. It is useful only if you use it. The question is not, why would they do this to me? The question is, what does this teach me about the kind of people I have been allowing into my inner circle? Because betrayal rarely begins at the moment of impact. It begins at the first small boundary you ignored, the first subtle discomfort you rationalized, the first inconsistency you smoothed over because the connection felt good or familiar or strategically advantageous. You sensed something, your body registered it, but you chose coherence over clarity. You chose the comfort of the existing narrative over the friction of revising it. And now the revision has been forced. There is a temptation in this phase to harden indiscriminately, to decide that trust itself is the mistake, to conclude that vulnerability is naive and that emotional openness is a liability. But that is not strength, that is reaction. And reaction is still a form of control, just control that belongs to the person who hurt you. If your new identity is built entirely around never being hurt like that again, then they are still shaping you. They are still defining the architecture of your future relationships. Nietzsche's alternative is more demanding. He would ask you to become more selective, not more closed. More perceptive, not more paranoid, to refine your standards rather than abolish your capacity to connect. He would ask you to examine the traits you admired in the person who betrayed you and separate the genuine virtues from the theatrical ones. Charisma is not character. Intensity is not loyalty. Shared enemies are not shared values. And perhaps most importantly, he would insist that you do not waste the injury by converting it into bitterness. Bitterness feels powerful in the short term. It gives you a narrative where you are morally superior and emotionally justified. But it also freezes you in place. It keeps the betrayer alive inside your attention. Indifference, by contrast, is earned. Indifference is not the absence of feeling. It is the reallocation of energy. It is the moment you decide that your attention, which is finite, which is one of the most valuable currencies you possess, will no longer be spent rehearsing conversations that will never happen or constructing arguments that will never be heard. It is the decision to withdraw psychological investment from someone who has already demonstrated that they cannot carry it responsibly. This does not mean pretending it did not matter. It mattered. It mattered because you invested something real, time, trust, emotional access, and those are not trivial resources. But the fact that something mattered does not obligate you to keep engaging with it after it has revealed its true structure. One of Nietzsche's most provocative ideas is that of self-overcoming. The capacity to use every experience, especially the painful ones, as material for growth rather than as evidence of permanent damage. Betrayal, in this sense, becomes a kind of initiation, not into cynicism, into discernment. You begin to notice patterns you previously ignored. You pay attention to how people speak about others when those others are not present. You observe how they handle minor conflicts, because major betrayals are almost always preceded by smaller ethical fractures. You watch whether their words and actions align over time, not just in emotionally charged moments. You also turn the lens inward. Where were you overextending? Where were you trying to secure loyalty through generosity rather than through mutual respect? Where were you mistaking proximity for depth? These questions are uncomfortable. They require you to relinquish the fantasy that you were purely acted upon, but they also restore agency. They remind you that while you cannot control another person's character, you can control your access policies. And access is power. Not everyone deserves the unfiltered version of you. Not everyone has earned the right to your long-term plans, your vulnerabilities, your private fears. There is strength in gradual disclosure. There is intelligence in allowing people to demonstrate consistency before granting them intimacy. This is not manipulation, it is calibration. The person who betrayed you has shown you something invaluable, what misaligned character looks like when it is close enough to cause damage. That knowledge, if integrated rather than resented, sharpens you. It makes you slower to idealize and quicker to verify. It makes you less impressed by performance and more attentive to pattern. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative shifts. You are no longer the person to whom this happened. You are the person who learned from it. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you realize you survived something that could have made you smaller and instead allowed it to make you more precise. You speak less about loyalty and demonstrate more of it. You demand less reassurance and observe more behavior. You stop announcing your standards and simply enforce them. The betrayal becomes a reference point, not a residence. And in that transition, from injury to information, from reaction to refinement, you step into a different kind of strength. Not the loud, performative strength that needs witnesses, the internal kind. The kind that does not rush, the kind that does not chase explanations from people who have already explained themselves through action. At some point, you stop needing closure. Not because you received a satisfying explanation, not because the other person suddenly developed the self-awareness to articulate what they did and why, but because you understand something more fundamental. Their behavior was the explanation. People reveal themselves in patterns, not in promises. You replayed the conversations, you analyzed the inconsistencies, you searched for the hidden variable that would make it all coherent. But coherence is not always available. Sometimes the only clarity you get is this: they valued something else more than they valued you. Their comfort, their ambition, their ego, their fear of confrontation. Whatever it was, it outranked loyalty. That hierarchy tells you everything you need to know. There is a strange liberation in accepting that you misjudged someone. It feels like failure at first. Your pride resists it. Your mind wants to defend the original assessment because admitting error feels like weakening your own authority. But in reality, the refusal to update your judgment is the true weakness. Strength is the willingness to revise your model of the world when new evidence appears. You trusted based on the information you had. Now you have more information. That does not make you foolish, it makes you adaptive. Nietzsche spoke often about the danger of ressentiment, the slow, corrosive resentment that builds when someone feels wronged and powerless. It is the emotional posture of those who cannot act, who cannot transform their anger into forward movement. Betrayal can easily push you into that state. You imagine their eventual downfall. You fantasize about vindication. You rehearse the moment when they finally understand what they lost. But every minute spent there is a minute not spent building something that makes their betrayal irrelevant. The most decisive response to betrayal is not retaliation, it is elevation. You do not need to destroy them, you need to outgrow them. Outgrowing someone is quiet. It does not involve announcements. It does not require dramatic exits. It is visible only in retrospect, when the gap between your trajectory and theirs has widened so significantly that the original wound feels almost abstract. You look back and realize that the betrayal redirected you toward higher standards, sharper perception, stronger boundaries. It forced you to clarify what you will and will not tolerate. It refined your circle. It removed an illusion. And illusions are expensive. They cost time. They distort decision-making. They make you invest in futures that do not exist. When an illusion collapses, it hurts, not only because of the loss of the person, but because of the loss of the imagined future you built with them. You grieve a version of reality that was never fully real. But once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And that clarity, harsh, unsentimental, precise, is a form of freedom. You no longer need them to understand you. You no longer need them to regret what they did. You no longer need to correct the story they tell about you to others. Your energy shifts toward construction rather than correction. And construction is where power lives. Power is not loud in moments like this. It is disciplined. It is the decision not to chase what walked away. It is the refusal to explain yourself to someone who has already demonstrated they are not committed to understanding you. It is the composure to let your absence speak where your words would only invite distortion. There is a temptation, especially if the betrayal damaged your reputation or altered shared social space, to defend yourself aggressively, to correct every narrative, to counter every insinuation, to ensure that no one walks away with a version of events that casts you unfairly. But you cannot control every narrative, and attempting to do so often binds you more tightly to the situation you are trying to transcend. People who know you deeply do not require a press conference. People who are committed to misunderstanding you cannot be convinced through argument. Your task is not to win the courtroom of public opinion. Your task is to protect your integrity in private and allow consistency over time to establish your credibility more effectively than any emotional defense ever could. Time is ruthless with pretenders. It is patient with the disciplined. The person who betrayed you may initially appear to benefit. They may secure alliances. They may control the immediate story. They may seem unbothered, even emboldened. This is the phase where many people break. They interpret temporary optics as permanent outcomes. But character compounds. So does the lack of it. You do not need to accelerate consequences. You need to maintain alignment. You need to ensure that your future actions are so consistent with your values that anyone paying attention will see the contrast without you pointing to it. There is strength in restraint. Restraint is not passivity, it is strategy. It is the understanding that immediate emotional satisfaction is often purchased at the cost of long-term positioning. When you resist the urge to lash out, you are not suppressing truth, you are choosing timing. And timing matters. The version of you that reacts impulsively is predictable. The version of you that absorbs impact, evaluates, recalibrates, and moves deliberately is difficult to anticipate. And unpredictability, when grounded in self-control rather than chaos, is a form of leverage. You begin to notice something subtle. The intensity of the pain starts to shift, not disappear, but change texture. It is less sharp, less all-consuming. You can hold it without it dominating every thought. You can engage in your work, your training, your routines without constant interruption. This is not indifference yet. It is integration. The betrayal becomes part of your narrative, but it is no longer the headline. It is a chapter, a defining one perhaps, but not the conclusion. And when you reach this stage, something important happens. You stop asking, why did they do this to me? You start asking, who am I becoming because this happened? That question is forward-facing. It assumes growth. It assumes authorship. And authorship is the opposite of victimhood. When you shift into authorship, the energy reorganizes. You begin to evaluate your habits, your standards, the way you allocate time, the people you allow proximity to, the risks you are willing to take, not from paranoia, but from refinement. The experience forced you to see that trust is leverage, and leverage must be handled with precision. You become slower to speak and faster to observe. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop volunteering vulnerabilities to people who have not demonstrated the capacity to hold them. You understand that access is earned through consistency, not through shared intensity. And you realize something that feels almost uncomfortable in its clarity. You can survive without them. Not emotionally overnight, not without processing, but structurally, practically, existentially. The version of your future that required them was an assumption, not a necessity. This realization is stabilizing. It returns your center of gravity to you. Betrayal destabilizes because it reveals that you anchored part of your sense of security in someone else's character. When that character fractures, the ground shifts. But once you accept that your foundation cannot depend on variables outside your control, you begin building differently. You invest more in skill than in approval, more in competence than in validation, more in discipline than in emotional reassurance. This does not make you cold, it makes you self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is not isolation. It is the condition under which connection becomes a choice rather than a dependency. When you no longer need someone to stabilize you, you can evaluate them clearly. You can see whether their presence enhances your trajectory or merely soothes your fear of being alone. Betrayal strips away illusions about permanence. It reminds you that people can change alignment quickly when incentives shift, that loyalty without shared values is fragile, that admiration without respect collapses under pressure. These realizations are not pleasant, but they are powerful, because once you internalize them, you move differently. You test slowly. You trust gradually. You observe under stress. You listen not only to what people say about you, but to what they say about others when convenience disappears. And in doing so, you protect your future without hardening your heart beyond recognition. There is a maturity that forms here. It is quiet. It is not theatrical. It does not broadcast that it has been hurt and survived. It simply operates with sharper awareness. You no longer romanticize potential, you assess behavior. And behavior rarely lies. The person who betrayed you gave you a masterclass in misalignment, painful, expensive, unrequested, but instructive. And when you stop viewing the experience solely as loss and start recognizing it as education, something shifts internally. You are not grateful for it, but you are no longer destroyed by it. That difference is everything. There comes a stage where the emotional charge no longer dictates your behavior. You still remember, you still understand what happened, but it no longer controls the direction of your day. The betrayal becomes context rather than command. This is where real strength begins to show. Not in confrontation, not in proving a point, but in the steadiness of your forward movement. You begin setting standards without announcing them. You remove access quietly. You decline invitations without explanation. You stop negotiating with people who have already shown you their limits, and you do it without drama. Drama is a bid for attention. Discipline is a bid for sovereignty. The difference is subtle but decisive. When you operate from sovereignty, you do not need them to regret their decision. You do not need public vindication. You do not need mutual acquaintances to validate your version of events. Your internal alignment is enough. And over time, something almost ironic happens. The absence of your reaction becomes more powerful than any reaction could have been. Silence forces reflection in people who are capable of it, and exposes insecurity in those who are not. You do not orchestrate this. You do not aim for it. You simply maintain your trajectory. And that trajectory, consistent, focused, increasingly refined, creates contrast without effort. Contrast reveals character. Your growth reveals their stagnation. Your discipline reveals their impulse. Your stability reveals their volatility. You do not need to narrate this contrast. It becomes visible on its own. And somewhere in this process, you notice a subtle shift in identity. You are no longer the one who was betrayed. You are the one who handled it. That distinction matters. One identity centers the wound. The other centers the response. And response is where agency lives. You understand now that betrayal was not an interruption of your path, it was a test of it, a pressure point that exposed weaknesses in perception, in boundaries, in expectations that required refinement. Tests are not punishments, they are evaluations, and you passed the part that matters most. You did not collapse into resentment permanently. You did not let the experience define your entire narrative. You processed, you recalibrated, you rebuilt. That rebuilding is not visible to everyone. It does not trend, it does not announce itself, but it compounds. Each day you act from clarity rather than from injury. You strengthen a version of yourself that is harder to destabilize next time. Not invincible, but resilient. Not cynical, but discerning. Resilience is not about never being hurt again. It is about never being reduced by the hurt. And when you reach that point, when the experience that once consumed your thoughts now feels like a completed lesson, you realize something quietly empowering. You are no longer reacting to the betrayal. You are operating beyond it. The morning after betrayal is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a human being. You wake up, and for a fraction of a second, the world is still what it was. And then it is not. Then the knowing returns and you are back in the landscape that the betrayal created, with the same wreckage around you and the same work ahead of you. And then another morning, and another. Nietzsche did not promise that the work gets easier in a linear sense. He promised something better. He promised that the person doing the work gets stronger in a cumulative sense, that each day the foundation is a little more solid, a little more genuinely yours, a little less dependent on the external circumstances that betrayal so completely disrupts. That the version of you that meets each successive morning is incrementally less defined by what was done to you and incrementally more defined by what you are choosing to build. There will come a morning, not soon enough, but certainly, when you realize that you have not thought about them first thing, when the day begins in your own territory rather than in the wreckage of theirs, when what you are building has grown large enough that it occupies the center of your attention rather than the vacancy left by what they destroyed. That morning is not the end of the process, but it is the evidence that the process is working, that the investment in your own becoming is beginning to yield returns that the investment in the relationship that betrayed you never could have. That morning is coming. It is built from every hour you spend doing the work these principles point toward, rather than spending those hours in the backward orbit of resentment and rehearsed grievance. It is built from every choice to direct the energy of what happened toward the construction of what comes next, rather than the continuous prosecution of what already occurred. It is built from the daily, unglamorous, profoundly consequential decision to be the author of your own story, rather than a character in theirs. Nietzsche survived betrayal. He survived abandonment, dismissal, the specific cruelty of being understood by almost no one during his lifetime, and from that survival, from that specific fire, he built a body of thought that has outlasted every person who ever dismissed him, every relationship that ever failed him, every institution that ever closed its doors to him. Not because survival was enough, because he refused to let survival be all that it was, because he took what the experience gave him and turned it into something that transcended the experience entirely. You have that same capacity. The betrayal is not the last word on your story. It is not even close to the last word. It is raw material in the hands of someone who has not yet finished building. Get back to work.